Scarface laughed, a cruel sound that made Nichi's skin crawl. You want us to let her go? Then you must pay the price. Before Nichi could react, Scarface raised his machete high into the air. Time seemed to slow as the blade glinted in the sunlight. No! Diola screamed. The machete came down with brutal force, severing Nichi's right hand. Pain exploded through his body, and he fell to the ground, clutching the bloody stump where his hand had been. But the nightmare wasn't over. Another soldier stepped forward and swung his machete, cutting off Nichi's other hand. Nichi was the kind of man who drew attention wherever he went. His tall, imposing frame, smooth ebony skin, and captivating smile made him the subject of many whispers in Amanquo village. Women swooned when he walked by, and men admired his strength and courage. But for all his charm and good looks, Nichi had eyes for only one person, Diola. Diola was a beauty in her own right. Her bright eyes sparkled like stars, and her laughter had a way of making the world seem lighter. Nichi often teased her, saying, "If you laugh like that in the market, even the goats will stop chewing to listen." She would blush, hiding her face behind her hands, and Nichi would laugh, proud to be the one who brought her such joy. Though they lived in a small village surrounded by forests and farmland, their love was larger than life. From sunrise to sunset, they were inseparable. They worked together on the farm, shared roasted yams under the shade of the irako tree, and walked along the riverbank in the evenings. It was the kind of love that made the elders smile knowingly and the youth envious. But Nichi's life had not always been filled with such warmth. He was an orphan, raised by the village after his parents died in a tragic accident when he was just a boy. Despite his struggles, Nichi had grown into a man the entire community respected. He worked hard, helped anyone in need, and carried himself with dignity. Diola was his greatest joy, the one who filled the void in his heart and gave him something to live for. One fateful day, as Nichi tended to his crops, his hands moved with practiced ease, pulling out weeds and planting seeds. The rhythm of his work was soothing, the kind of peace that came from knowing his labor would bear fruit. But that peace was shattered in an instant. Terrified cries echoed through the forest. Nichi froze, his heart pounding as he saw villagers running past the farm. Their faces were etched with fear, and their voices were filled with panic. "Warriors," someone shouted. "The enemy has come. Theirs is war." Nichi's stomach turned. His first thought was not of himself, but of Diola. He dropped his tools and began running towards the village, his feet pounding against the dirt path. The closer he got, the louder the chaos became, shouts, wails, the clanging of weapons. When he reached the outskirts of the village, his worst fear came true. The enemy had invaded, their soldiers dragging men, women, and children from their homes. Smoke billowed from burning huts, and the air was thick with the scent of fear. Then he saw her. Diola. She was being dragged away with her family, her hands bound behind her back. Her usually bright eyes were now filled with terror, and tears streamed down her face as she struggled against her captors. "Nichi," she cried when she saw him. The sound of her voice broke something inside him. Without thinking, he ran towards her, his heart screaming louder than the voices around him. "Leave her alone!" Nichi shouted, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "Take me instead. Let her go." The soldiers holding Diola stopped and turned to face him. They were rough-looking men, their faces hardened by years of violence. One of them, a tall man with a scar running across his cheek, sneered. "Who is this one?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "A hero, eh?" Nichi ignored the taunts and fell to his knees before them. "Please," he begged. "I will do anything. Take me and let her go. She is innocent." Diola was sobbing now, struggling even harder against her captors. "No, Nichi. Don't do this," she cried. But Nichi didn't listen. His love for her was stronger than his fear. Scarface laughed, a cruel sound that made Nichi's skin crawl. "You want us to let her go? Then you must pay the price." Before Nichi could react, Scarface raised his machete high into the air. Time seemed to slow as the blade glinted in the sunlight. "No!" Diola screamed. The machete came down with brutal force, severing Nichi's right hand. Pain exploded through his body, and he fell to the ground, clutching the bloody stump where his hand had been. But the nightmare wasn't over. Another soldier stepped forward and swung his machete, cutting off Nichi's other hand. The pain was indescribable. Nichi's vision blurred, and his body shook uncontrollably as blood pooled around him. But even in his agony, his thoughts were only of Diola. He lifted his head, his face contorted in pain, and looked at her. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run, Diola." But she couldn't run. The soldiers dragged her away, her screams echoing in Nichi's ears as darkness closed in around him. Nichi lay on the ground, his life slipping away with every drop of blood. The once lively village was now silent, the enemy having taken what they came for. Smoke still rose from the charred remains of huts, and the air was heavy with the scent of death and despair. But Nichi was not dead. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside him, a spark of life remained. A spark fueled by the love he had for Diola and the hope that, somehow, he could save her. His body was broken, but his spirit was not. As the sun began to set, Nichi clung to life with a determination that defied logic. He would not let this be the end. Nichi lay motionless in the bushes, his body weak and battered. Blood seeped into the soil beneath him from the stumps where his hands used to be. Every breath was a struggle, and his mind felt foggy. The world around him was quiet except for the faint sound of leaves in the breeze. Groaning softly, he closed his eyes, and everything faded into darkness. For a long time, it was as though he no longer existed, no thoughts, no memories, just silence. Not far away, Diola's ordeal was just beginning. She, her family, and other villagers had been taken by the invading warriors to a nearby settlement. They were marched for hours through the forest, their hands and feet bound tightly. The captors ignored their cries for mercy and dragged them into a new nightmare. When they arrived, Diola and the others were thrown into a large, cold prison. The walls were made of stone, and iron bars sealed them inside. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the sound of sobbing and the hopeless murmurs of other captives. Diola could barely think of anything except Nichi. She couldn't erase the image of him falling to his knees, begging for her freedom, only to be struck down in the most brutal way. His blood, his pain, his sacrifice, it was all too much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him lying there, lifeless. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to herself, "He's gone. He's really gone. No one could survive that." Her family noticed her sorrow. They tried their best to comfort her, but nothing worked. Her father, a quiet but strong man, gently rested a hand on her shoulder one evening. "Diola," he said softly, "you have to be strong. For all of us. We can't give up hope." But Diola could barely muster a response. How could she be strong when she felt like a part of her had been ripped away? Her memories of Nichi, of their laughter, their love, only deepened her pain. Life in the prison was unbearable. The captors gave them just one meal a day, a small piece of yam or watery porridge, barely enough to keep them alive. Early each morning, the warriors would come, shouting and striking the bars with sticks to wake the prisoners. "Get up. Time to work," they barked, their voices harsh and unkind. The prisoners were forced to work on the king's farmland, a vast field that stretched for miles. Their hands and feet were chained as they toiled under the blazing sun, planting seeds, pulling weeds, and harvesting crops. The work was grueling, and the chains made it even harder. The sun burned their skin, and their bodies ached with exhaustion, but the warriors showed no mercy. Diola worked silently, her heart heavy with sorrow. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind wandered. She thought about her life before the invasion, how Nichi would tease her, how they would walk hand in hand along the riverbank, how his laughter made her world brighter. Those memories felt distant, like a dream she could never return to. When the sun began to set, the warriors would round up the prisoners and march them back to the cell. Their hands were chained again, and they trudged back, too tired to speak. By the time they returned, most collapsed onto the hard floor, their spirits crushed. Diola, however, could never sleep. While the others drifted into restless slumber, she would sit by the small window of the cell, staring at the sliver of sky visible through the bars. The cool night air brought little comfort as she whispered silent prayers. God, if Nichi is alive, please protect him. If he's gone, let him find peace. And please, help me survive this. Her prayers were the only thing that kept her going. Yet deep down, she felt sure Nichi couldn't have survived. She remembered the blood, the pain in his eyes, and the cruel laughter of the men who had taken everything from him. The thought of him lying somewhere, lifeless and alone, broke her heart. Her father, sitting nearby one evening, tried to speak with her again. Diola, he said gently, you're holding too much pain inside. You have to let it out. Tears welled in Diola's eyes as she shook her head. What's the point, Papa, she whispered. Crying won't bring Nichi back. It won't free us from this place. There's no way out. Her father then sighed deeply, his own grief evident in the lines on his face. But hope, my child. Hope is the only thing they can't take from us. As long as we're alive, there's a chance, even if it's small, that things will change. But hope felt impossible for Diola. Day after day, the routine remained the same. Wake up, work in the fields, return to the cell, eat the meager meal, and endure another long, cold night. Each day drained more of her strength, and her spirit felt like it was slipping away. One evening, as the prisoners were being marched back to the prison, Diola stumbled. Her legs, weak from exhaustion, gave out beneath her. She fell hard to the ground, scraping her knees on the rough dirt path. A warrior behind her cursed and yanked her chain roughly, forcing her to stand. Move, he shouted. Diola bit her lip to hold back tears, limping as she continued forward. Her mother, chained beside her, reached out and gently squeezed her hand. Stay strong, my daughter, she whispered. You are stronger than you know. Diola wanted to believe her mother's words, but it was hard to feel strong when everything around her was so dark. She felt like she was drowning in sadness, with no way out. That night, as she sat under the small window and gazed at the stars, she whispered another prayer. If there's even the smallest chance, let me find it. Let us all find it. The day dawned with unusual activity in the settlement. The air buzzed with anticipation as the warriors barked orders, forcing the captives to clean and repair the palace. Diola, along with the other prisoners, scrubbed floors, patched walls, and carried heavy loads under the watchful eyes of their captors. The reason for all this fuss soon became clear: the king's son, the beloved prince, was returning home from his travels overseas. The prince was known far and wide for his charm, intelligence, and kindness. Stories about him painted a picture of a man who was not just handsome, but also wise beyond his years. The villagers spoke of him with admiration, calling him the king's pride and joy. His return was cause for celebration, and the palace was to be spotless for his arrival. For Diola, however, none of it mattered. As she scrubbed the floor of the grand hall with her sore hands, her thoughts were miles away. She couldn't stop thinking about Nichi, about the life they had dreamed of together, now shattered. Tears threatened to spill as she worked, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to draw attention. By midday, the sound of drums filled the air, signaling the prince's arrival. He entered the palace on horseback, his tall frame and striking features drawing gasps from everyone who saw him. His skin was smooth, his hair neatly trimmed, and his clothing, a mix of traditional and modern styles, reflected his time abroad. He carried himself with confidence, and his warm smile made many hearts flutter. But as he dismounted and walked into the palace, his expression changed. Inside, he saw the prisoners. Their thin bodies and sad faces spoke of the suffering they had endured. The sight of them, bent over with their chains rattling, repairing and cleaning the palace, filled the prince with anger. He turned to his father, who stood nearby, and said, "Father, what is this? Why are these people being treated like this? They look like they've been through enough. The king, a proud and stubborn man, frowned at his son. They are prisoners, he replied gruffly. They were taken during the last raid. They work to repay their debt to this kingdom. The prince shook his head, his jaw tightening. This is not right, he said firmly. These people are not animals to be used like this. They have families, lives, dignity. We must let them go. The king's face darkened, but he said nothing, waving his hand dismissively as if to end the conversation. The prince didn't push further at that moment, but he resolved to speak to his father again. He couldn't stand the sight of innocent people suffering. The next day, the prince decided to tour the palace grounds. He wanted to see more of the people being held captive, to understand their plight better. As he approached the prison, the guards quickly unlocked the gates and stepped aside, bowing low in respect. Inside the cold, dark cell, the prisoners sat quietly, too weary to move. But one figure caught the prince's attention immediately. There, in the corner of the cell, sat the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Even in her tattered clothes, and with her tired, sorrowful face, Diola's beauty shone through. Her skin glowed softly in the dim light, and her eyes, though heavy with sadness, sparkled faintly like hidden stars. The prince couldn't take his eyes off her. "Who is she?" he asked the nearest guard, his voice low and curious. The guard stammered, unsure how to answer. She's just one of the prisoners, my lord." "Bring her out," the prince commanded, his voice firm. The guards hesitated for a moment before obeying. They unlocked Diola's chains and helped her to her feet. She stumbled slightly as they led her out of the cell, her legs weak from exhaustion. When she stood before the prince, she didn't lift her eyes to meet his. She simply stood there, silent and still. "What is your name?" the prince asked softly. "Diola," she said in a barely audible voice, her gaze fixed on the ground. The prince smiled gently. "Diola," he repeated, as if testing the sound of her name on his tongue. "Come with me." He led her to a private chamber in the palace, away from the prying eyes of the guards. The room was grand, filled with fine furniture and warm sunlight streaming through the windows. Diola stood awkwardly near the door, unsure of what to do or say. The prince offered her a seat and said kindly, "You don't have to be afraid. I mean you no harm. Tell me, what's wrong? Why do you look so sad?" For a long moment, Diola didn't respond. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her eyes remained downcast. Finally, in a voice thick with emotion, she said, "A part of me was taken from me because of the war." The prince leaned forward, his brow furrowing in concern. "What do you mean?" he asked gently. Diola hesitated, her throat tightening with emotion. "There was someone," she said slowly, her voice trembling. "Someone I loved deeply. He gave everything to protect me. Her words faltered as tears streamed down her face. "He sacrificed himself, and I don't even know if he's alive. I feel like I've lost everything." The prince's heart ached at her words. He reached out and placed a comforting hand on hers. "I'm so sorry, Diola," he said softly. "I can't imagine the pain you're going through. But I promise you, I'll do everything I can to help you." That night, the prince made sure Diola didn't return to the prison. He gave her a room in his chambers, instructing the palace staff to ensure she was comfortable and well fed. Diola, though grateful for his kindness, remained quiet and distant. Her heart was still with Nichi, wherever he might be. The prince, determined to make things right, went to speak with the king again. "Father," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "these people have suffered enough. They deserve to go home. Keeping them here like this is cruel." The king sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand, my son," he said. "Letting them go would make us appear weak. Our enemies would take advantage of us." "Strength is not in cruelty," the prince argued. "It's in justice and mercy. These people are not our enemies. They are innocent. Please, let them go." The king didn't respond immediately. He stared at his son for a long time before saying, "I will think about it." Though it wasn't the answer the prince wanted, he held on to hope. He returned to his chambers that night, determined to do everything in his power to free Diola and the others. For now, he could only wait and pray that his father would do the right thing. Meanwhile, Diola lay awake in the comfortable bed the prince had given her. The softness of the mattress and the warmth of the blankets should have been comforting, but her heart felt heavy. She thought of Nichi, of his sacrifice, and wondered if she would ever see him again, and then he parents in the cell. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered into the darkness, "Nichi, may your soul find rest." The king sat in his grand chamber, deep in thought. He had noticed how often his son, the prince, visited Diola. It was clear that the young woman had captured the prince's attention, and the way his son looked at her was unmistakable. The king couldn't deny that Diola was stunningly beautiful, even in her simple clothing and with the sadness that lingered in her eyes. One evening, after a few days, he called the queen to his side. The queen, a graceful woman with a sharp mind, listened as the king shared his thoughts. "Our son has grown fond of one of the prisoners," the king said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "She's the one they call Diola. A beauty, no doubt, and her presence seems to bring out something in him, a softness, a warmth I haven't seen before." The queen smiled knowingly. "He's falling in love," she said. "It's obvious." The king nodded. "Yes, but this situation is delicate. The prince has urged me to release the prisoners, and I've decided to grant his wish. However, as for Diola and her family, they will stay. I will give them a house and farmland in the village, close enough that the prince can visit her often. This way, he can see her without upsetting the balance of the kingdom." The queen agreed with the plan, and the king wasted no time putting it into action. The next day, he summoned the prisoners to the palace courtyard. They stood nervously, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. The prince stood beside the king, his expression hopeful. The king raised his hand, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "You have served your time," he announced. "And because of the kindness and wisdom of my son, I have decided to release you all. You are free to return to your homes and rebuild your lives." A wave of relief swept through the prisoners. Many fell to their knees, tears streaming down their faces as they shouted their thanks. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you, my prince." The king held up his hand again, to quiet them. As for Diola and her family, he continued, his voice firm but not unkind, "You will remain here, but not as prisoners. I will give you a house and a large farmland in this village, to start anew. You will be close to the palace, where you can live in peace." Diola's parents, overcome with emotion, dropped to their knees before the king. "Thank you, Your Majesty," her father said, his voice trembling. "You have given us a new chance at life." Diola, though initially surprised, felt a deep sense of relief. Freedom was finally within reach. She turned to the prince, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. The prince smiled at her. "You deserve this," he said softly. "And so much more." The following months brought a sense of peace and joy that Diola hadn't felt in a long time. Her family settled into their new home, a modest but comfortable house surrounded by fertile farmland. They worked hard, planting crops and tending to the land, and the prince visited often. He would bring small gifts, fresh fruits, colorful fabrics, and foodstuff. At first, Diola was reserved. Her heart was still healing from the pain of losing Nichi, and she wasn't ready to open herself to anyone else. But the prince's kindness and patience slowly broke down her walls. He never pressured her, never demanded anything. Instead, he simply spent time with her, talking, laughing, and helping with the farm work. As the months turned into a year, Diola found herself smiling more often. The weight in her heart began to lift, replaced by a growing affection for the prince. He was gentle, thoughtful, and caring, and she couldn't deny that he had become a source of light in her life. One evening, the prince knelt before Diola in the garden behind her house. "Diola," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "you are the most incredible woman I've ever met. You've endured so much, yet you remain strong and kind. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me? Tears filled Diola's eyes as she nodded. Yes, she whispered, her heart pounding. Yes, I will. The wedding was the grandest event the kingdom had seen in years. The palace was decorated with flowers and colorful banners, and people from all over came to witness the union of the prince and his bride. Diola, dressed in a stunning gown gifted by the queen, looked radiant. Her beauty left everyone in awe, and the prince couldn't take his eyes off her. That night, after the festivities had ended and the palace had grown quiet, Diola sat by the window of her new chamber. The rain was starting to fall, a gentle patter against the glass. She smiled to herself, feeling a happiness she hadn't known in a long time. Her heart was full, and for the first time in months, she felt truly at peace. As the rain began to pick up, she moved to close the window. But just as she reached out, she froze. A shadowy figure stood in the courtyard below, barely visible in the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat as she peered closer. The figure stepped forward, and her heart stopped. It was a man, a tall, gaunt figure with no arms. Diola's hand flew to her mouth, and her knees felt weak. She knew that silhouette. She knew the way he stood, the curve of his shoulders, the shape of his face. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. Nichi, she whispered, her voice trembling. Her heart raced as the figure remained still, staring up at her. The rain fell harder, soaking his tattered clothes and making his ebony skin glisten under the faint moonlight. He didn't move or call out, but his presence was undeniable. It was him. Tears streamed down Diola's face as a whirlwind of emotions surged through her: shock, joy, guilt, and a deep, aching sorrow. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the man she had thought was lost forever stood before her, alive but changed. What did this mean? Why was he here now? And how could she face him after everything that had happened? As the rain poured and the night deepened, Diola's world, which had seemed so perfect just moments ago, began to unravel. The story continues. This concludes the first part of our captivating story, Neche and Deola. A tale of love, sacrifice, and resilience in the face of unimaginable odds. But the journey is far from over. With Nichi's shocking return, Diola's world has been turned upside down. What will happen next? Will their love survive the trials of destiny, or has time and tragedy changed everything? Find out in part 2, coming soon, only on The Moral Compass. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales that inspire and move you. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of Neche and Deola. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think.